The rain tapped steadily against the windshield as the old sedan climbed the narrow road through the Blue Ridge Mountains. Margaret stared ahead, though her eyes no longer followed the curves of the asphalt. Everything felt distant. Beside her, Henry drove in silence, both hands gripping the steering wheel, his shoulders stiff with exhaustion. They had left Asheville before dawn, carrying what remained of their lives in the trunk. They had not planned this journey. It had been decided for them. The house they lived in for more than 40 years was gone. The place where birthdays were celebrated, where scraped knees were kissed, where nights were spent worrying about bills and mornings began with coffee and quiet hope. Their children had sold it. Not out of need, they said, but out of practicality. The house was too big, the upkeep too expensive. It was time to simplify. Margaret still heard those words echoing in her mind: practical, necessary, best for everyone. No one asked how she felt watching strangers walk through her living room, measuring walls and judging memories. No one asked Henry how it felt to sign papers he barely understood anymore, trusting that his children knew better. Trust had always been his weakness. Now they were headed to a small town near Boone, somewhere Henry's cousin once mentioned, where rent was cheap and expectations were low. It was not a home, just a place to land. The road grew quieter as the rain thickened. Fog crept down from the trees, swallowing the distance ahead. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think we made the right choice?" she asked softly. Henry did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the road. "I don't know if we had a choice," he finally said. The car suddenly jerked. The engine sputtered once, then again before falling silent. Henry eased the vehicle to the shoulder as the rain continued to fall, heavier now. He tried the ignition, nothing. Again, still nothing. Margaret felt her chest tighten. There were no lights, no houses, no signal on her phone, just trees, fog, and the growing cold. Henry stepped outside, lifting the hood, though both of them knew it was useless. When he returned, his face said everything. "We can't stay here," Margaret whispered. The temperature dropped quickly. Their breath became visible. Margaret rubbed her hands together, trying to keep feeling in her fingers. She thought about the warmth of the old kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of familiar walls settling at night. All gone. Then she saw something move through the fog. At first she thought it was her imagination, but the shape grew clearer. A large dog stepped onto the road, its golden fur damp from the rain, one paw held slightly off the ground. It looked at them calmly, without fear. Margaret opened the door without thinking. The cold air hit her face, sharp and biting, but she stepped out anyway. The dog did not run. It turned and walked a few steps, then stopped, looking back as if waiting. Henry joined her slowly, his knees stiff, his breath shallow. The dog began to move again, heading away from the road and toward the dark trees. Margaret hesitated only a moment. Something deep inside her said staying meant giving up. She took Henry's hand, and together, guided by a wounded animal and a fragile hope, they stepped into the unknown. The path grew uneven as they left the road behind. Wet leaves clung to their shoes, and small stones rolled underfoot. The rain thinned into a cold mist that settled on their coats and hair. Margaret felt her toes go numb, then her ankles. Still, she kept moving. Henry leaned on her shoulder, his breathing shallow, each step slower than the last. The dog walked ahead, limping slightly, pausing often to look back, as if counting them. Time lost its meaning. The forest seemed endless, the silence broken only by wind through branches and Henry's labored breath. At one point, Henry stopped completely. "I need a minute," he said, his voice barely audible. Margaret turned, panic rising. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to share warmth she barely had. The thought struck her with cruel clarity. After everything they had survived, this could be how it ended, not with a goodbye, but with a quiet disappearance. Memories flooded her mind. Long nights sewing to make extra money, Henry leaving before sunrise, coming home with aching hands. Every sacrifice made so their children would never feel fear the way they once did. And now here they were, forgotten on a mountain trail. The dog returned, pressing its warm body against Henry's legs. It stayed there, steady and calm, as if lending strength. Margaret swallowed hard. A stranger, an animal, showing care when family had not. "Okay," she whispered, "just a little more." They continued, slower now. Margaret spoke softly as they walked, reminding Henry of small things. The creek behind their old house, Sunday pancakes, the way he used to hum while fixing things. Each word was a thread tying him to the moment. Then Margaret saw it, a faint glow between the trees. At first she thought it was another trick of exhaustion, but the glow grew brighter. A tall iron gate appeared, framed by stone pillars. Beyond it stood a large house, lights glowing warmly against the dark forest, smoke rising from a chimney. Henry lifted his head. "Are we seeing this?" The dog barked once and moved forward with sudden energy, pushing through the gate, which stood slightly open. Margaret felt tears well up. Hope hurt, but she let herself feel it anyway. They crossed the driveway, each step heavier than the last. Before Margaret could knock, the door opened. Warm air rushed out, carrying the smell of wood and something familiar like soup. Voices followed, concerned, gentle. Hands reached for them, wrapping blankets around Henry, guiding them inside. Margaret barely registered faces. The shock of warmth made her knees buckle. Henry was helped into a chair near a fireplace. Someone pressed a mug into Margaret's hands. Her fingers shook so badly she nearly dropped it. A woman with kind eyes crouched beside her. "You're safe now," she said. "He's been waiting." Margaret frowned. "Who?" The woman hesitated. "The owner of the house." Margaret looked around at the walls, the quiet order, the sense that everything here had purpose. None of it made sense. Why would someone like this be waiting for them? As Henry was taken to rest, Margaret noticed the dog walking confidently through the hallway, tail low but steady, as if this place belonged to him. A strange feeling settled in her chest, relief mixed with fear. Whatever waited for them in this house, she knew one thing: their journey was far from over. Margaret sat alone for several minutes, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring at the flames dancing inside the fireplace. Her body had begun to warm, but her hands still trembled. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear quiet voices and the soft steps of people moving with purpose. Henry was being cared for, and that knowledge was the only thing keeping her upright. The dog lay near the hearth, its injured paw stretched carefully in front of it. Every so often, it lifted its head and looked toward the hallway, alert but calm. Margaret studied the animal and wondered how something so hurt could still guide others. A woman named Eleanor finally approached her. Her hair was gray, her voice steady, the kind that carried both authority and kindness. She asked Margaret to follow her. The dog rose immediately and walked ahead of them. They moved through a long corridor lined with photographs, old faces, old places, lives that had passed through time and left traces behind. Margaret felt as though she were stepping into a memory that did not belong to her. At the end of the hallway, Eleanor opened a door. Inside, an elderly man lay in a bed near a large window. His body looked frail, but his eyes were sharp, filled with awareness. The dog climbed carefully onto the bed, and the man smiled faintly. "You found them," the man whispered. Then his gaze shifted to Margaret. Margaret Collins. Her breath caught. No one had called her by her full name in decades. Not like that. The man introduced himself as Robert Hayes. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. He spoke of a business partnership long ago in Ohio with Margaret's father, a small operation built on trust, and how he destroyed it through greed and fear. He took what was not his and left another man with nothing. Margaret listened, her heart pounding. She remembered the sudden move when she was young, her father growing quiet, her mother counting pennies at the kitchen table, the shame that settled over their home without explanation. Robert told her he had spent a lifetime trying to repair the damage, letters written and returned, calls never answered, private investigators who found nothing. Someone had made sure the truth never reached her family. Then he said the words that crushed what little strength she had left. "Your children knew," he said softly. "They intercepted everything." Margaret felt the room tilt. Her children, the one she defended, the one she trusted without question. The sale of the house, the sudden control over finances, the decisions made without her voice. It was not care, it was control. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. This pain went deeper than anger. It stripped something essential from her. Robert reached for her hand with trembling fingers. "I failed your father, and I failed you." Margaret stood frozen, realizing she had reached the lowest point of her life, not lost on a road, not in the cold, but betrayed by the people she loved most. As she left the room, her legs barely held her. The truth followed her like a shadow, and she knew that once spoken, nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat beside Henry's bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as the storm outside slowly faded. When morning came, pale light filled the room, soft and quiet, as if the world itself were giving them time to catch up with the truth. Robert Hayes passed away just after sunrise. Margaret was there when it happened. He held her hand, his grip weak but deliberate, as if that final moment mattered. There were no dramatic words, only a look of relief, like someone finally laying down a burden carried for far too long. The dog lay at the foot of the bed, unmoving, eyes open, understanding more than anyone expected. In the days that followed, everything Robert had promised was confirmed. Legal documents were clear, prepared long before his illness worsened. What he had taken decades earlier was returned, not as charity, but as restitution. The estate, the funds, the house itself were placed in Margaret and Henry's names, protected in a way that no one else could control or alter. Margaret did not feel joy. What she felt was grounding, proof that they had not imagined the slow erasure of their lives, proof that they were not confused, not weak, not dependent. What had been taken from them had a name now, and so did their worth. Henry listened quietly as everything was explained. When asked what they wanted to do next, he answered without hesitation, "We want peace." They chose a simple life. The house became a place of rest, not display. No luxury, no excess, just warmth, quiet mornings, and the ability to decide for themselves again. They placed firm boundaries where trust had been broken, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. There was one reunion. Their youngest daughter, Emily, arrived weeks later, carrying guilt and relief in equal measure. She had tried to speak years earlier, tried to warn them. She had been pushed aside, told to stay quiet, made to feel small. Margaret embraced her without anger. Some truths arrive late, but they still matter. Together, they decided to use part of what had been returned to create a small foundation. Nothing grand, just help for older people who had been manipulated, silenced, or stripped of their choices by those they trusted. Quiet help, dignified help. The dog stayed with them. He healed slowly, favoring his paw less each day. He slept near the door at night and followed Margaret through the house during the day. To her, he was more than a companion. He was a reminder that sometimes salvation comes without explanation, asking only to be followed. Months later, Margaret sat on the porch, watching the mountains change color as the sun dipped behind them. Henry rested beside her, peaceful. She thought about everything they had lost and everything they had regained. Not money, not property, voice, choice, dignity. This story is not just about betrayal. It is about remembering that growing older does not mean becoming invisible. It means carrying a lifetime of value that deserves respect. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and follow the channel for more stories about truth, resilience, and new beginnings at any age.